you so much for inviting CCNCSJ to this very important event on National Indigenous Peoples Day, especially at this time when we can take this opportunity to express our solidarity and our condolences to the Indigenous communities over the discovery of the 215 and other children found in unmarked graves in Kamloops and other places. I am grateful, truly grateful, to be joining you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Let me start with my own personal journey. I came to Canada in 1980 and started my university education. I did not learn anything about colonization or the genocide of Indigenous communities in my undergraduate studies, nor in my graduate studies in social work. I was particularly interested in social policies, but I'd never learned about, there was no courses at all that talked about the systemic racism, the colonization, and the impact of all those on racialized or Indigenous communities or Black or Asian Canadian communities. It was actually through my activism and involvement in CCNC that I came to learn about the long history of connections between Chinese settlers and the Indigenous communities. Starting in mid-1800s, Chinese gold miners were accepted by the Indigenous communities and had lived side by side in the broader hostile world of white colonists. When the Chinese laborers who were shunned by the white communities after the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway, linking our country from coast to coast, many of these workers again found refuge in the Indigenous communities. They were welcomed and accepted as who they were by the Indigenous communities. So as Chinese Canadians, we really owe the Indigenous communities a heartfelt thank you. So CCNC initiated a redress campaign for Head Tax and Exclusion Act in the 1980s. I remember very well the redress conferences that I attended in those days, where I learned for the first time the extremely painful and traumatic accounts from families of children of residential schools that never returned. I also learned that the South African government studied our Indian Act and Indian reserves to help establish their apartheid regime. I was ashamed, I was angry, I was extremely stressed. In 1988, Japanese Canadian communities obtained redress for the internment of Japanese during the Second World War. Then Chinese Canadian communities, we also received our apology and redress the federal government on June 22nd, 2006. Yes, tomorrow marks the 15th anniversary of the redress and apology. Yet, our first peoples in Canada that have been stripped of the rights, their land, their livelihood, their culture, and their language, and continue to be dehumanized, are still waiting for reconciliation and justice. The pandemic in this last year and a half has certainly amplified and exacerbated anti-Asian racism. Chinese and other East Asian Canadians are becoming more aware of racism and its impact. However, we should also take the time to educate ourselves about our role in perpetuating anti-Indigenous racism, our own biases, our discrimination, and our responsibility in sustaining a society that continues to deny Indigenous rights. Chinese and Asian Canadians really need to understand and acknowledge how systemic racism, colonialism, and white supremacy collectively and distinctly impact on Indigenous, Black, Asian, and other racialized communities. As an activist, I continue to learn about Indigenous rights and how to be an ally. I learn from the leaders of Indigenous communities that I need to approach things with humility, that I need to approach as an ally with humility. So recently we were asked to speak on an issue about the rights of Asian sex workers because the Ontario government was going to propose an anti-trafficking legislation, and unfortunately it was passed. We were asked to speak up in solidarity with Asian sex workers because the legislation would have devastating impact on them. So my colleagues and I at CCNC wanted to find out how would the Indigenous communities react to that legislation, given that over 50% of all the women trafficked in Canada are from the Indigenous communities. So CCNC's position has to be aligned with the Indigenous communities, particularly with the Indigenous women's groups and the recommendations, of course, from the Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So CCNCSJ is committed to advancing this awareness amongst Chinese and Asian Canadian communities about the impact of colonialism on Indigenous communities and the call for reconciliation and justice. We are ensuring that all of our anti-Asian, and anti-racism training materials start with the conversations and the discussions about Indigenous rights and the call for actions for reconciliation and justice. We are committed to calling out anti-Indigenous racism, and we are committed to working in solidarity with Indigenous communities with humility to ensure that all the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, are put into actions. So thank you very much again, and I wish you all a very happy National Indigenous Peoples Day.